Welcome to this episode of Political Science Matters. My name is Tom Mastillo, and I co-edit the European Journal of Political Research's Political Data Yearbook with colleagues and co-editors Raul Gomez and Michelangelo Versesi. We host discussions about pressing political matters, including elections in Europe and other OECD countries. And today we're here to discuss the recent elections in the United States. Held last week on Tuesday, November 5th, 2024. We're having this conversation today on a day when President Biden will be meeting with President-elect Trump at the White House. And this happens at the invitation of President Biden to discuss the transition. The certification of the presidential election that we're here to discuss will take place on January 6th, 2025, and the inauguration will follow on January 20th. My guests are Jay McCann. Jay is a professor of political science at Purdue University. His interests lie in the study of public opinion and political psychology, in campaigns, elections, and political parties, and in the immigrant experience and incorporation especially. Welcome, Jay.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here.
And our second guest is Meredith Conroy, a professor of political science at California State San Bernardino, and a contributor to the 538 production, where she writes about women and gender in politics, about race and representation, and other political topics. Welcome, Meredith.
Oh, great. It's great to be here.
So in many U.S. settings, I think election night has traditionally been a very kind of collective experience, a shared experience, a social one. I remember over the years of my adult life that I've often hosted election kind of watch parties with friends. They were often very bipartisan affairs where you would remind people as they walked in the door that the room very likely would contain, other types of partisans and to tone down the extremism of the partisanship. This year, I was watching it quietly at home on my television. I didn't find it all that particularly interesting or surprising. I don't think there were too many surprises. There were some signals of what was to come about the outcome, but I went to bed before it became clear and found out myself at 3 a.m., like many people, I think, just checking a headline when you kind of wake up and take a peek. So that was my election night. How did you guys spend the night?
Yeah, I mean, I've been at those kind of parties too in past years. There's a heck of a lot less of that happening these days. In my case, here on the Purdue University campus, the students had a watch party and they had pizzas, and I was on a little faculty panel. And so that was all fun. That broke up around 8:30, 9 o'clock, well before anything really was called. So kind of like you, I went home. My wife was actually out of town on something, so I was alone watching it. I gave up around midnight. I watched the returns and I could see signals, but unlike you, I didn't wake up at 3 o'clock and check. I just turned on the radio in the morning and heard whatever there was to be known.
I was at this watch party that you describe at Purdue in 2016, the first time there was a
Oh, wow.
Trump presidency. Yeah, and it was kind of a great occasion. A lot of civic spirit. The students were pretty engaged, and as you say, there were speakers of all sorts.
Well, this is a very mixed campus actually too. I think because they ask students about their partisanship, but just impressionistically, it seems pretty balanced. Indiana's a red state, meaning that it tilts towards the Republicans pretty reliably. It's not enormously red, but it's sort of leans that way, and that kind of rubs off on campus culture here. So it was a little bit like that rare moment of diversity, political diversity, right? When you're in a big group and people are maybe minding their words a bit.
Yeah, harder to find these days, as you said. Meredith, how about you? How did you spend the night?
So I was covering the election with 538, which is associated with ABC News. So we were on I was assigned to the ABC News live blog. And so essentially what that means is I'm at my desk, and I've been live blogging election night with 538 since 2018. And I'll set up two monitors so that I have what I'm working on in front of me, and I have a big monitor on the side where the live blog continually updates, and then the television. For the live blog, I was assigned to cover some of the down ballot races where women were in competitive races for congressional seats. So my prep was mostly about women to watch in those races. I had a few presidential states that I was assigned to call. They were like Delaware, the ones, that They leave the swing states to the election watchers, the poll experts at 5:38. So I had I think New Mexico, Delaware, and Maine. I was assigned to call when been called by Associated Press or ABC News was calling races too. So yeah, I was mostly watching those. Obviously, also interested in the outcome of the presidential election, but my attention early in the night was focused on congressional races and returns for some of them where women were running and competitive. And, we're still watching, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later on in the podcast, but there are a lot of competitive races where women are running that still are not called. But it does look like overall, though, that there won't be many women added to Congress this year. I think one of the first years that we haven't added at least a few women, and that has a lot to do with Republicans who their primaries didn't nominate very many women to places that were competitive or safe. I think they'll add maybe 2 new women to Congress, the Republican Party. So that's what I was watching, but also obviously attuned to what was happening in the presidential race throughout the night. But I was up till midnight West Coast time. So
Very good. You can have some fun with that. 5:38 is ready to call the election, but Delaware hasn't come in yet. Meredith, make the
Meredith, you have
call,
to
Meredith.
stay on. Meredith, we need you to stay here until Delaware is called.
Well, and the headline outcome, of course, is that Donald Trump won the presidential election. And I think that with politics in the U.S. being so sort of famously polarized, many of our listeners in Europe might be interested in hearing about how Americans have reacted to the outcome, especially the presidential outcome, but perhaps also the others. I'm in this same state that Jay described a moment ago, Indiana. I think the last time Indiana went Democratic for a presidential election was it Barack Obama in
Yeah, first
2008?
in
Yeah.
2008.
And furthermore, I'm at a Catholic university, and I think it too is a mixed community of ideologically and partisanship. J.D. Vance, of course, is a kind of somewhat famously a Catholic convert. Kind of really had worked hard to mobilize, I think, that voting bloc. Around here, I'm not teaching. I'm on sabbatical, so I'm not seeing a lot of students, but I'm hearing stories from colleagues about, in their classes, for example, about kind of a real desire by students to talk about the election, to kind of process it. It sounds like in the circles that I've been poking into, there's some people who are really kind of stunned and seeking to process sort of the results probably on both sides, I would certainly say, around the country. But in any case, what's your experience been? Have you been teaching? How's the reaction been in your circles?
So I've been doing a graduate seminar this semester on U.S. politics. So it's kind of heavy on some classic democratic theory, big weighty books. But it's been hard to kind of keep to that steering just because it's inevitable. We're going to be talking. Yesterday, we had a seminar dedicated to theories of presidentialism. Okay, big topic in American and comparative politics. But yeah, okay, so half of the time though, we were talking about the election and trying to explain what was going on. It's been, very much a subject of concern and interest. Last week, I held a talk back with undergraduate students, a big group after the election, a couple days later. My goal there was just to kind of hear what they're saying. I know on other campuses, there's been lots of concern about rampant anxieties and uncertainties, and maybe even some student-on-student difficulties and aggressiveness. And I wasn't picking up on a lot of that, fortunately, with our students, but I was picking up on just some basic surprise and some concern. One of the students, the story of immigration in this country is largely a story over the last 20, 30 years about settlement in these tiny little kind of rural places like Mishawaka, Indiana. And that's where she was from. And so she was just kind of mystified. How can people in this state or really anywhere not realize how many immigrants are here and how integrated they are into the community and all that they're doing? And, she was just more confused than anything else. And this is a political science major too, but she was just trying to wrap herself around that. And tomorrow night, I got invited to a group called Purdue Immigrant Allies, and it's much more of an activist group. And so, I might get a sort of different tone in speaking with those students. So that's been, I would say in general, students are just trying to navigate through the uncertainty. I remember much more shock and disbelief after 2016. So I guess, yeah, Trump, the campaign was rough in so many ways. A lot was said, a lot of rhetorical excesses and all that. But the fact that Trump is old news, it still shakes people up, but I think 2016 was worse.
Yeah, I mean, famously, they say that even he didn't expect to win in 2016. A lot of it was the element of surprise at that time. This time, I think it seems more like emotional, like jubilance on one side and sort of concern on the other side. Meredith, how about you? How are you teaching?
I am teaching,
Yeah.
yeah. And I also wonder, I know maybe we're jumping ahead a little, but I do wonder how much surprise the Trump campaign, how surprised they were with this one too. You know, some of the rhetoric in the last week led me to think that they thought that they were cooked. And so one of the reasons that they kind of doubled down on some of the more, extreme rhetoric and, some of the guests, at the famous now the event in New York City at Madison Square Garden, they had a number of guests that were saying, pretty caustic and extreme things. So a little bit as I was watching some of the things they were focusing on down the stretch, it did make me think that they maybe thought that their numbers weren't looking great, focusing on some of these like strange online influencer and conspiratorial things on the internet. And even if they didn't end up winning by mobilizing their base and energizing their base towards the end, they would have had some, momentum for any calling into question the election results, which it sounds like they were ready to do in a number of states, right? So I think that there may be some surprise for them, but probably less surprise than they were in 2016. I am teaching right now, and I teach at California University San Bernardino, as you mentioned. And so while California is a pretty blue state, San Bernardino is in the Inland Empire. And for our international audience, that's east of LA and is actually pretty politically diverse. So there are there are 5 congressional districts that essentially touch our university. And when I teach the congressional section of American politics, I have students use this website where you can put your zip code in to determine who your member of Congress is. And all of the time, the zip code isn't enough information for it to tell my students who their member of Congress is. They need the streets because there are so many members around us, and they are Democratic and Republican. So my students are pretty politically mixed, but I do get the sense that they were surprised, but mostly just very interested. So I'm teaching a public opinion course. We've been studying public opinion all semester. We've been talking about the election. We've been talking about different demographic groups and how they vote. And my students are it's a Hispanic serving institution, and it's largely first generation. And so what they wanted to talk about after the election was the Latino vote. A lot of them are sharing anecdotes, but you can tell that they are learning quite a bit from this public opinion class. So they're not just thinking about what their grandma said to them the day they went to the polls or how their cousins reacted to those comments from Madison Square Garden. They are then putting it into the context of some of these things that we've talked about, like linked fate. That was sort of gratifying to hear them not only bring up some of the anecdata from their conversations with their family members, but to try and couch it in what we've been studying. So they mostly wanted to talk about the shift according to exits, and the Latino vote towards Trump, especially men. They had some thoughts about that. And one young woman was born and raised in Mexico, but was also talking about how in Mexico, electing a woman. So it can't just be like wholesale misogyny. And they talked about how young men in particular that immigrate to the US, or if they're second, third, or fourth generation, that their parents are pressuring them to assimilate more heavily. So that could explain it. So we had a long conversation about those sorts of topics in my public opinion class.
Very good, very good. And this we'll come back to this maybe in just a little bit. But before we get there into some of those more nuanced kind of observations, let's just kind of lay out where we are on this date a week plus later. In the U.S., as in many other places that we cover in the Political Data Yearbook, election night is not just about a single election. There are many, as you alluded to earlier, Meredith. So, in a parliamentary system, of course, the outcome there will drive many of the executive branch kind of outcomes. So here, so why don't we just, Jay, could you please maybe summarize for us where we're at as far as the national level elections, what we know, how close do you think we are to knowing who in particular is going to control the House?
To say the obvious, Trump won the Electoral College vote. He got 312 electoral votes. And some of your listeners might not be intimately familiar with the workings of the Electoral College. It's hard to find any comparable institution in any other democracy, but that's what we have in the US, for better or worse. It's state level votes generated, and 270 is sufficient to win. So Trump surpassed that by a lot. He got 312 electoral votes, but it was still a close election if you look at human votes. So he won 50.2% of the popular vote. So squeaked out just a bare majority. For what it's worth, it doesn't sound like much, and it really isn't much of a majority, but it's the first time since 2004 that a Republican presidential nominee has gotten the majority of votes. Trump won key battleground states. So, Pennsylvania, Michigan, the ones that were internationally talked about, Wisconsin, Georgia. He also improved his tally in Democratic leaning states like Virginia and New York. So, it's a remarkable comeback, you'd have to say, in spite of everything and in spite of the kinds of campaign dynamics that Meredith mentioned. So it was, yeah, very much a win for him. And it was sort of a general accomplishment for the Republicans across the board. In the Senate, it's going to be at least 52 Republicans and in a 100-seat body. So they're going to have the majority. Pennsylvania is still coming in. They're counting the absentee ballots, and then the margin is liable to be so narrow that's going to trigger a recount as well. So that's a little bit up for grabs. Democrats have 47 seats. So, they lost a number of races. Ohio and Montana, I guess, the most noteworthy, where you saw incumbent Democrats lose. There was a flip in West Virginia from Democrat to Republican. That was very foreseeable. In the U.S. House at this moment, now it's about 12:30 p.m. East Coast time on November 13th as we're talking. And I'm saying that just because, there's a lot of late breaking outcomes. But there are 207 Democratic members of the U.S. House, incoming members, as opposed to 216 Republicans. So 218 gets you to a majority. There are 13 House races still yet to be decided. And Republicans then are just too shy of taking the majority. So if you were going to bet, you'd say, yeah, the House is going to have another narrow majority of Republicans. What's interesting to me are the state ballot initiatives as well. There were a number of things going on at the state level that really speak to me about whether we should think of this as a kind of ideological or issue mandate. Given all the red all around, it's tempting to just say, oh, there's a realignment or issue-based mandate. But boy, that's a tough argument to make given other kinds of outcomes. So, but Meredith, I see you nodding your head now.
Yeah, I could talk about, in particular, the abortion, initiatives or measures that suggest exactly what you're saying, that while the Electoral College victory could suggest a sweeping success for conservative ideology. So yeah, some of these down ballot measures on abortion would suggest otherwise. So there were 10 states that had measures of some kind related to certifying or codifying or protecting abortion access in various states, and it passed in nearly all of them. So Arizona, Colorado, Maryland, Missouri, Montana, Nevada, and New York all passed some type of measure initiative that would protect abortion access in their states. Notably, Florida's failed, despite getting, I think, last count I saw was nearly 58%. I haven't seen an update. I don't know what it is at this point, but the reason that one failed is because in Florida, they require a 60% threshold to pass an initiative. So while a majority supported abortion protections in Florida, it didn't pass. And then also there was one in South Dakota that outright failed. So those are the ones that I was watching. I know there are others. And Jay, if you want to jump back in and mention some on other issues that suggest that while the voters supported Trump at the top of the ticket, that they were they also would be described as democratically owned issues in their states.
So I don't know if legalized marijuana is not, an obvious democratic. It seems, there's support that's pretty widespread. And in several states, ballot initiatives to legalize recreational marijuana, and they passed in states that went solidly Trump. The Dakotas and Florida, pretty red places. But even, I guess, to me, a couple even more interesting things than that. In a few places, they had kind of wage-related economic ballot initiatives, whether to increase the minimum wage or whether to allow lower wages for tipped workers. That was one in Arizona. And across the board, well, in California, raising the minimum wage is still kind of up in the air. But remarkably to me, when you ask people, call this maybe economic populism in the traditional sense of the term, right? Worker rights, increased wages, and so on. Voters are there backing those kinds of, and I guess you would say those are sort of very traditional Democratic New Deal kinds of concerns. And then here's another thing that I think is interesting. I'd be interested to hear what you guys think. But in more than a few states, they put on this ballot initiative to prohibit non-citizen voting. Now, non-citizen voting is this sort of urban legend that floats around. There's like no evidence whatever of illegal voting by people who aren't US citizens. And yet it's sort of this devil in the shadows that is brought out as something, if you want to use it as yet another argument, against immigration and so on, or if you want to make the case that US elections aren't fully legitimate, that's something that's raised. That's been investigated a lot. There's no evidence of illegal voting by non-citizen immigrants, and yet this ballot initiative was put on for political reasons. Ballot initiatives can be used to kind of stoke and frame issues and help get your vote out. Okay, so wherever they were on the ballot, majorities said, well, yeah, we should prohibit non-citizen voting, but that's sort of like, that's not interesting. We would expect that. What is interesting is that the margin, if you average across all these states, 1 out of 4 voters did not support that prohibition. Okay, which to me is an astounding minority, right? But that's way more of a no vote on that than I would have thought. And so it suggests to me that it's just not a concern for a pretty large group, in spite of all of the kind of polarization and rhetoric around immigrants and people, doing bad things to our electoral process and all this fraudulent behavior that's out there that there's very little evidence for. So I don't know. I guess I found that surprising. I don't know if you guys are similarly surprised.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, given the normal sort of socialization, political and whatnot we have in the U.S., I'm surprised about the size of the no vote. Is that how you can no
Yeah,
right to vote for immigrants? Yeah. 25% seems large to me. Of course, I don't have it in front of me, the comparative data on that, but I think it's fairly common, is it not, that given certain amount of time in residence, that immigrants, even without citizenship, can vote in places. Do you guys know any?
Oh, and yeah, no, it's not unusual in other
Yeah,
democracy where citizenship means one thing, but even non-citizens can take
yeah,
part in elections. And you can kind of see the argument that it's just letting somebody vote can be a way to help incorporate them into society and so on. It can facilitate that kind of transition. There's less to worry about in terms of election administration if you just have open registration like that. You don't have to worry so much about documents and the like. So it's not uncommon in other democracies. You can find examples around the world. And for what it's worth, in selected locations around this country, non-citizens have the right to vote in local elections, not federal elections. They're barred from federal elections. But so, school boards or
yeah.
mayors, things like that. And you can kind of see, if you want to argue this out and take some of the politics, if you can, away from it, you can kind of see, well, if you're a long-term resident and you have kids in the school system and you have an opinion about who's on the school board, you can, and you're certainly affected by those decisions. So you can say, well, therefore, why shouldn't somebody who's otherwise part of the community be able to vote like that? But obviously, that's a real magnet for controversy, and it's not for nothing we saw these ballot initiatives.
Yeah, a controversy for in this setting, though, as you suggest, I think elsewhere, some of our listeners might be surprised to hear that, given the rationale you just described for doing so, which carries the day in many in other places. Meredith, did you want to jump in on that as well?
Yeah, some other notable outcomes would be that this will be the first time that 2 Black women are serving in the Senate at the same time. Yes, Angela Alsobrooks of Maryland and Lisa Rochester in Delaware. There have only ever been 3 Black women to serve in the Senate and never two simultaneously. So that is a first that we'll see when these new members of Congress are inaugurated. Speaking of non-presidential races, with Kelly Ayotte, she won her governor's race. She's a Republican woman, and there will now be 13 women serving simultaneously as governors out of 50. So near more than half of governors in the US will be women after she's inaugurated. Most of those are Democrats. With her winning, that'll be 5 out of the 13 are Republican women, and the remaining are Democratic serving governors. So that was also a notable first. And then there was one flipped seat, depending on where you look. I'm not sure if it's called, but it looks like Janelle Bynum, a Black woman of Oregon, will win in her congressional district, but she'll beat another woman of color, Lori Chavez DeRemer, who won a close race last cycle, a Republican woman. So Janelle Bynum should win there, and that'll be a first for Oregon. And, the Center for American Women in Politics is, it's called CAWP, CAWP, for our international audience. If you're interested in other firsts that women have achieved this election cycle, they have a running list on their website where they're keeping track of some of these milestones. But yes, I think that 2 Black women serving in the Senate at the same time is one of the bigger, and the 13 women serving simultaneously as governor are 2 of the bigger milestones for women this cycle.
So let's talk a little bit more about the campaign surprises, maybe. I guess as I read the headlines and swim in these waters myself, I feel like cross currents. There's a sense that the general election was a resounding victory for President-elect Trump and the Republicans generally. But the evidence is sort of mixed, as you alluded to earlier, Jay. On the one hand, the margins of victory in a few swing states are really tight, and had 3 or so gone the other way, the outcome would have been completely different. On the other hand, I think the Republicans, did they win at the presidential level all of the toss-ups, or nearly all of the toss-ups?
Yeah, all of
The
them.
whole blue wall,
Yeah,
right?
they did.
Was
it all the blue wall?
Yeah, all 7 swing states went for Trump.
So Jay, how do you think about these results, and kind of what do they teach us, maybe?
It's tempting to look at campaigns and to say, that Trump's strategy of doubling down on, his version of identity politics, or Biden coming out at the 11th hour and saying some clunky things about, trashy people who are supporting the Republicans, or what, he got misquoted and so on. But, it was a last minute sort of one-day story. It's tempting, if you follow the news like I think we 3 do, and probably many of your listeners, right? It's tempting to really fixate on campaign events and kind of think about shoulda, coulda, woulda, if only this had happened, if only Biden had stepped out before. But I think, to me anyway, as I've thought about this, a kind of simple retrospective voting kind of model, that when you look at the mindset over the last couple of years in polls, you look at the percentage of people who think the U.S. is on the wrong track. You look at Biden's approval ratings only in the upper 30s, and they didn't change very much. You look at, misgivings about the border with Mexico, real concerns about inflation, which objectively the U.S. looks okay, comparatively speaking, on inflation, and they've gotten it down around 2%, like where they wanted it to be. But I think for people who are actually buying groceries and trying to get housing, there is a housing crunch in this country. And all of this just breeds a lot of frustration. And it's kind of short-term coming out of COVID, short-term frustration. And so that was a tough hand for any Democrat running for president, and the Democratic Party. It was a tough hand to deal with.
Kind of any incumbent, right? I mean, I think
Right.
that this has been an experience.
An anti-incumbent. And for what it's worth, how many countries around the world, there's so many elections being held of late, over the last year, say, in general, you can look at some very different countries all around the world, including Britain, India, South Korea, Poland, Argentina, South Africa, and we could go on. And in general, it was hard running as an incumbent. So there is this backlash. Even in Mexico, a country I was following pretty closely during the campaign, the dominant party succeeded in recapturing the presidency. But I think that's an exception that kind of proves the rule to me, because that dominant party, even though, yeah, by all measures, it is the dominant party, but the tone that was set by the outgoing president, Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, was always, he's an outsider. I'm fighting these big, powerful interests. Even though he was the incumbent president for 6 years, he still campaigned like he was this outside of power and mobilizing the people, against these larger elite forces. And he profited from that. So even when you're an insider, if you're successful in claiming to be an outsider, you can harness that anti-incumbent kind of mindset. So I guess that seems to me to be a decent explanation, at least to start with.
That's great. Thank you, Jay, for those reflections. Meredith, do you want to add to it or fill in a little bit maybe about your particular perspectives here about the role of gender in this election? I mean, Americans had a chance to
Yeah,
break the
twice.
glass ceiling, on this one. But
Yeah.
instead, a majority chose Donald Trump, who I think was widely viewed as being a real turnoff to women voters. Harris had the endorsement, of course, of Taylor Swift, and there was all these signals, I think, of much more momentum in her direction. So what happened? How do you process this result in that respect?
I agree with Jay's assessment. I think that's where, given the shift, right? It's not like it was just young men that shift to the right, and I'll get to that in a minute. And it wasn't just Latino men, right? It was pretty remarkably Trump won back all sorts of groups from Biden in 2020. I think the rare exception from what I've seen from exit polling should be interpreted with caution. And there are usually, for international communities, the Pew Research Center tends to, however, months later, share a voter validated analysis of various groups and how they voted. But based on the exits, yes, nearly everyone shifted to the right, except for, I think, white college educated women, Black women, and I think actually voters over 60 or 65. But otherwise, the move right was widespread. So yeah, I think that Jay's point that you had these larger forces, economic forces, the notion of wanting change broadly, I'm right there with how Jay articulated it. That said, I do think there are a lot of interesting things bubbling under the surface about gender, and the way that both of these campaigns spoke to men and women voters, I think, is important to watch, because it does signal potentially how they're going to go forward and who they think about as their coalition. And that could impact the decisions that they make. And it could also impact the way that, if people start, paying attention, the way that they feel about the Republican Party in particular representing them. In addition to all the things that Jay said, one thing that I do find really compelling are discussions about the media environment and how Democrats essentially have ceded the online ecosystem to the right and to conservative messages. And you have, according to communication scholars, they call these news avoiders. You have plenty of people in the US, especially after 4 years of Trump and X number of years of COVID, they actually just don't want to see political news. So they aren't consuming news as we think of it in a traditional sense. They're obviously still getting news and information from social media and from influencers incidentally, and subtly from various folks that they follow on social media, friends or influencers or celebrities. But if that's their only source of information, you're going to struggle to show people that this democratic backsliding is happening, or that democracy is threatened, or you have someone like Trump who is talking about rolling back civil servants in the administrative state. They're not going to get that from someone baking bread. What they're going to get is, yeah, my yeast was more money, or if I own a restaurant and I can't find anyone who's going to work. Like, these more basic messages, I think, favor Republicans or favor the out party. So I'm really interested in how Democrats are thinking about what they need to do more broadly to be a player in this new media ecosystem that we have, where a majority of Americans distrust mainstream media. And in fact, during the COVID years, Democrats' trust of media surged, but it's back down. I mean, it's still 50% of Democrats still say they have somewhat or a lot of trust in mainstream media, but it's down. And Republicans, it's like single digits, say that they trust the mainstream media. So that's something I'm going to be watching as someone who studies political communication. I'm really interested in how Democrats try and fix that or be relevant in these online media spaces. It's not to say they don't have anyone there, but I do think they favor Republicans. And Republicans have always been better about representing their views in alternative media like radio. And so that's one thing I think I'll mention. But I do want to talk briefly about the gender gap. So the gender gap was much anticipated, and it actually looks very similar to 2020 when it was relatively small compared to 2016, which I believe is one of the largest gender gaps on record, depending on if you're looking at exit polls or this voter validated data from Pew. It's around 13 points in 2016. And then according to exits in 2020, it was around 10 points. And then according to exits in 2024, thus far, it's been 11 points. So 2020 and 2024 are really similar in terms of the gender gap, despite there being a woman on the ticket in 2024. And one lesson hopefully our audiences can take is that whether or not there's a woman at the top of the presidential ticket, gender is very much so relevant to the outcome and to the discourse and to people's perception of the presidency. The biggest gender gap, according to exits, though, was the Latino vote. So according to CNN exits, these are the national exits, 55% of Latino men voted for Trump compared to 38% of Latino women. That's a 17-point gender gap amongst Latino voters. And Black voters, it was big too, even though the vast majority of Black men and women vote Democratic. 21% of Black men and 7% of Black women voted for Trump for a 14-point gender gap. Again, these exits, consume them with a grain of salt, but these are around 20,000 or so responses. But for groups that are underrepresented in the US, they're probably even more underrepresented in these exits. So, but yeah, those are large gender gaps. One of the biggest anticipated gender gaps was amongst young people, 18 to 29. If you were following the US presidential election closely, you saw that lots of people speculating that young men were going to take a hard turn to the right because of Trump's very macho campaign that invoked ultimate championship fighting and Hulk Hogan and his youngest son, Barron, telling him to go on podcasts like Full Send Podcast with the Nelk brothers or Last Weekend with Theo Vaughn, Joe Rogan. Those audiences skew male and young. But according to the exit polls, the gender gap was around 12 points for young men and women, ages 18 to 29. 37% of young women voted for Trump compared to 49% of young men. So it still wasn't a majority, but definitely more Republican voters among that age group than in 2020.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I can validate that. I haven't even heard of some of these websites. Joe Rogan I've heard of, but the rest are not on my radar at all. Like not even the names of them.
Yeah, Theo Vaughn's is like I think 13 right now, but he's newly in the top. He's a comedian. A lot of these folks get their start in as comedians.
What it really, when Meredith is going through all of that, and I'm with you, Tom, I don't know a lot of these podcasters and figures she's mentioning, but yeah, the thing that really strikes me is how much fragmentation there is out there, just in general. And so, yeah, for sure in the media. So like the biggies, the CNNs and so on, yeah, they have so much X amount of market share, but there's so many spin-offs and so much less stability just in the general media environment. And so you have in that environment, everybody, you have so many people jumping in, trying to start up their own thing. It doesn't take a big investment to just start podcasting or send out your shingle. And I think that's really that whole kind of way of doing things and the way we kind of get informed and engage with each other. I think it's affecting the party system at large. And so the old conduits of mobilization and reaching out to people. I think the fall of the blue wall tells me as much as anything that the old mechanisms for mobilization, they're getting kind of rusty. And it's not clear kind of what should replace all of that, but it's certainly de-alignment, if not realignment. There's certainly a lot of fragmentation, I guess, across all these different groups. That increases the uncertainty.
So let's close by just noting, thinking ahead a little bit to the next 4 years under the Trump administration. He has begun to make some of his announcements for cabinet posts. We learned recently this week, the last couple of days, that Marco Rubio is expected to be the Secretary of State. He is a senator from Florida. We learned that Pete Hegseth, who is a Fox News host, a veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, will be nominated to serve as a defense secretary. We learned that a New York Congresswoman, Elise Stefanik, will be nominated to serve as the UN ambassador. Just thinking ahead a little bit about, Trump made a lot of promises and campaign kind of claims, some of them pretty inflammatory, I think, about rounding up immigrants and agendas with respect to many issues on the environment, on foreign affairs, on NATO, on China, on Russia, and so on. So I guess I'd like to close by asking you to react to the question about how do you see this playing out in the next 2 to 4 years? Maybe in some specific policy domain or just with the politics generally. The midterm elections will be coming soon enough in 2026, and so how do you look forward? Jay, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. No, great question. And this is all, of course, speculative. But when I think about two-term presidents, when you look at what was done in their second terms, typically there's a lot less going on in that second term as opposed to the first term. Listeners who are familiar with American politics are now thinking about Clinton, Obama, George W. Bush, and if you're really going to look at their signature issues, you'd really fixate on the first term. And there's an understandable reason for that pattern, I think. You're limited to 2 terms, and the further you get into that second term, the more of a lame duck you are, meaning that it's harder to encourage collaboration. It's harder to, well, the people around you are just naturally thinking about what's next. And so when I think about Trump, as a 2 term, this is a second term, even though he had that break, I think we're going to see everything operating at kind of warp speed. He's going to be the administration in a hurry. And he's bringing in a lot of loyalists, first and foremost, but also a lot of newcomers. So people who are not going to know the ropes. With major appointments, you mentioned, some of them like the Defense Department and so on. And Trump promised on doing things that would be very big and disruptive, like the tariff that might trigger some sort of trade war or something like that, or immigration. If there is, in fact, lots of deportation, that's going to involve a lot of binational, very sensitive negotiations. Where are these people going to go? Thinking about the next couple of years, I am expecting to see a fair amount of disruption or attempted disruption, a fair amount of pushback. 2 days before the inauguration, there's a mobilization plan for Washington, D.C., a march on Washington that is expected, according to the organizers, 50,000 people. That's at least what they've put in when they're getting the permit. So the opposition is not going to go away, and you're going to see a guy in a hurry to get things done with a lot of people who might not have much experience trying to accomplish a lot. And these are not the ingredients for a smooth, well-oiled implementation phase in a presidency that's already in its second half, and it may be difficult to pull together coalitions. So I would expect to see lots of disruptions, maybe some false starts and things like that as the new president tries to accomplish what he promised.
It'll make headlines, but these are hard agendas that he has actually proposed, right? And it requires competence and experience, and if they're coming in it without much experience, all the more difficult. Very, very interesting. Meredith, do you have anything to add as we?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. That a lot of the official discussion happening amongst people who he's proposing for these departments are definitely talking about, firing people. But that turnover is, you lose that competency, you lose that understanding of those departments and how things work. And yeah, it's going to slow things down. And as Jay mentioned, people are going to be throwing sand in the gears at every step of the way. And so if you have people who are also just learning the ropes, it could slow down their agenda. Absolutely. I mean, Trump famously proposes enormous, big ideas, but when you actually win and people are expecting you to deliver on those, are you able to? And it past his prologue, there isn't actually a real effort to try. I do think that will change this time around, that there will be a real effort to try to pass some of these bigger things that they've proposed, but that by dismantling the administrative state, which is one of the things that they propose, it'll slow down the degree to which they can implement some of these ideas. I think one that Jay didn't mention that we can anticipate, and this is not my area of expertise, but I was reading Don Moynihan, a public administration professor. He talked about we could probably expect like quite a bit of corruption that goes unpunished with Trump and, bringing in people like Elon Musk or with Trump nearly every day since he won. So I think we can anticipate some corruption that goes unpunished. But you should read Don Moynihan on that, not Meredith Conroy.
Well, thank you both for joining this conversation, and thank you to our listeners. We'll see you again on a later episode.
No,
Thank
thank you,
you.
Tom.
Excellent.